Yeah, we got a minute, so I'll go ahead and get going. Tim, I appreciate you joining on. We had pleasure of meeting Tim. He was at the Louisville Slugger Factory Museum a few months ago. Did kind of his book launch party and did a signing. I kind of talked to you about doing a Zoom call. So appreciate you joining in with us. I'll try to give you a little bit of a background, and then I'll let you kind of add in wherever you want. But Tim is a SABR member out of the Baltimore, the Babe Ruth chapter. And I've seen you've done a couple of bios here and there, and working on. Looks like you're working on a couple more. But one thing, for most of your books, looks like you're more of kind of a bluegrass music researcher and writer.
Yeah, I would say most of what I write is music. And this is going to maybe break some hearts here. I was actually a lacrosse player in college, so that may break some hearts. And lacrosse was my sport. I was always a baseball fan. I watched baseball, but I couldn't hit a curveball. And I found that my athletic skills tended to lend themselves to lacrosse a whole lot more. So I've played that. I've written a lot about lacrosse as well. But yes, music tends to kind of be my wheelhouse. I've done some music books. I write regularly for like Bluegrass Unlimited. I used to write Paste and Relics and stuff like that. But oddly enough, with what we're going to talk about tonight, I found a lot of similarities there, and I love writing about baseball and those stories as well. But yeah, music kind of tends to be where I tend to spend most of my time as far as writing goes.
Yeah. Well, then we'll kind of. So I'll get into kind of right into the first question. You're up from around Northeast, and you kind of like bluegrass and stuff. So why Pete Browning? What drew
Um,
him to you?
so after my second book, which was Leftover Salmon 30 Years of Festival, I don't know if there's any Leftover Salmon fans here, but they're a band that's been around for a long time. They're a pretty influential kind of jam grass band. I was on tour with the band. I was open each night kind of with a talk and a reading from the book. We were at the Ryman Theater in Nashville. Their tour was finishing up. My wife and I were then going to just take a little bit of a drive up to Kentucky. We went to Romp Fest and we ended up in Louisville, and we were doing the touristy stuff, and we went to the Slugger Museum. And they kind of told some stories of Pete on the tour. And I was vaguely aware as a baseball fan of Pete, but I have to be honest, I wasn't completely, you knew everything about him. And so as they're kind of telling these stories about him, my wife is kind of like, wow, this guy's really interesting. And there's some funny stories there. And I remember that night at dinner, we were just kind of like talking, having dinner, having a few beers, and just looking up stuff on our phones. Like, oh, look at this. This is an interesting story. And I was really drawn to him a little bit. And I kind of was curious why there wasn't more out there on him. So I said, well, I'm going to take the rest of the summer and see. Maybe there's what they talk about on the tour. That's all there is for him. Maybe there's not a story there. Maybe there's not enough, right? Maybe what we know kind of in the general understanding is all there is of him. And I kind of really became drawn to this story of him because it kind of fit into what I tend to write about a lot. And I don't mean music, but what I write about is often overlooked, maybe underappreciated bands or people who ever, achieved a high level of success, but for whatever reason aren't fully recognized. So I was really drawn to this idea that here's this player who achieved some great success, but then at the same time had these really odd quirks and this interesting life. And the more I dug into it, I really started relating to that side of it. It's something story I like to tell. And then from there just became so many other avenues I really enjoyed going around. Like, there was the myth of Pete, and I really love kind of like that kind of idea of like hearing the myth and what we all believe about something, but then what maybe might be the truth about it, or the potential truth there. So all of that really drew me into Pete as a story. And the idea that it was baseball is great. I love the history of baseball, and I love telling those stories and talking about those as well. But it was more him, and he was this interesting character who was, again, oddly kind of overlooked and kind of forgotten, and deserves maybe more recognition for his achievements in his life. So all of that kind of together is what really drew me into the story of Pete.
Yeah, and here I guess in Louisville, he's still kind of a bit of a local legend. I think every year the legend kind of diminishes a little bit, but we did actually have like a restaurant that adjoined the ballpark for a few years. It's called Brownings after him. So there's some stuff here and there to keep his memory alive. I know a lot of us in the Louisville group are appreciative of something to kind of um, you know keep his renewed kind of a new interest on Browning. I'll kind of show I got the book here. Yeah, before I go any longer, I should ask, if you want to copy another on Amazon, but then what's kind of the best way, for you, Tim, to try to order a copy?
Anywhere's great. Ordering directly from the publisher, which is the University Press of Kentucky, is always great. I also say too, if you've got a great local bookstore that you want to support, like, I'm all for that as well. So like, how about those great super local bookstores? But any of it's great. Ordering directly from the publisher is great. If Amazon's your thing, do that. If you like it, leave a review wherever you do your reviews on Amazon or Goodreads or wherever that may be. But yeah, you can get it anywhere out there. I think they may still have them at the Slugger Museum. So if you stop by there, you can probably still pick a copy up there if you're going down there or whatever. So yeah, but local bookstore is always a favorite of mine.
Yeah, I grabbed one at the Slugger Museum. I think they still have a few there. So, um, yeah, I enjoyed the book immensely. One of the things I actually really got to really help me out was I wasn't as familiar with kind of the history of baseball in Louisville, kind of leading up to the Eclipse and such. And I knew the Eclipse was probably the top team in Louisville, but I wasn't aware they were a pretty big thing nationally. They're one of the top like amateur teams before they joined the American Association.
Yeah, and I mean that was what was interesting too, is how good they were kind of as that semi-pro team. And I think what was interesting as compared to some other semi-pro teams that I kind of saw, and I can't make a blanket statement for every semi-pro team and kind of across the country, is that they were pretty much a homegrown team at the time. I mean, a lot of those players were from this area. They weren't, getting anybody else in the area. So I think that speaks a lot to the baseball that was happening in the city at that time and some of the talent they had, because a number of those players do go on to play in the major leagues and find success on a number of different levels.
Yeah, it's kind of just incredible. Like, all these guys, and you can read, but they all grew up together, kind of on the same street and such. Then all of them end up being, half decent players in the league. We'll get into that, but yeah. So the Eclipse joins the American Association in '82, and Browning had already been on the team for a couple years. He was really kind of from your research, saw he was really kind of a team phenom. And I was if you maybe talk about like his kind of his rookie year as a professional.
Yeah, I mean, he has a pretty monstrous year. He leads in batting, he leads in kind of most offensive categories. And I think it's kind of forgotten how young he was at the time, too.
Yeah.
He would have just been turned 21 that year, midway through the year. So he's a young guy, which I think is kind of overlooked for how successful he was. And he had a great season. I mean, and again, I know there's the perception of the American Association sometimes that it wasn't as talented. You know, from my research, it doesn't seem to be that was that true. It seemed players move back and forth between the two, American Association and National League, and generally they finished in the same kind of relative spot. So I think you can kind of say that what he did there would have translated on some level into the National League. But he had a monster season. I mean, he led in most offensive categories. And I think even something that kind of people overlook is he had a pretty good defensive year. I think his defensive skills are something that is generally he's given a negative kind of talked about or negative rating on it. And his defensive skills aren't as bad as we want to believe. There's reasons why they were worse, but he had a pretty good year that year. He was playing second most of the year. So again, I think that speaks to what his defensive skills may have been at some point in his life.
Well, you kind of point out in your book. He started off. He was playing shortstop, and I think, like you said, at the Slugger Museum the one day, you don't put a guy at shortstop if he can't field. So at some
Yeah,
point, he was a fielder.
yeah, I mean, he was good, and the general perception becomes later on, and I think that was part of what was interesting about Pete is there's all these myths about him, and we accept those because we just hear it, and it's what it is, and he's a horrible fielder, and he wasn't good, and he had that, but a lot of it was self-inflicted on some level, and some of it was because of his mastoiditis. So he had a severe health issue that basically rendered him deaf by the time he was a teenager, so he couldn't hear, and so a lot of his problems as far as fielding goes in the infield is he was afraid of getting run over. So he kind of kept backing up out of the base path. And, that's just not going to lead to good defense there. And so they eventually, moved him into the outfield and he kind of still refused to run because he still couldn't hear teammates calling the ball or calling him off the ball. And, so he kind of stood there and eventually he would just start making these kind of grand statements like, well, look, I'm not going to go chase down the ball because if I wear my legs out, what good am I at the plate? And instead of just admitting that he had a problem there, he tried to kind of cover it up that way. So I think his defensive skills at times are kind of looked at maybe in the wrong light because even later in his career, when his hearing was definitely kind of going down and he had vertigo that was really impacting him, there are games where they rave about how athletic he was, and they talk about he leapt 6 feet into the air to snag a ball and stuff like that. So that he still had those moments, but a lot of it was self-inflicted. So I think early on in his career, he was a pitcher early on. He played second short early on. So I think that he really was a good fielder. But then as these issues kind of started kind of overcoming him and becoming harder for him to deal with, he just kind of found a safe place for it, and that was to not move. And I can stand at the plate, I can swing a bat, and not have to worry about it.
Yeah, yeah. When I also should interrupt. If anybody, I got some questions I'm going through, but if anybody has, we have a chat going on there, then maybe just wants to join in with anything, feel free to ask questions. But just kind of Paul Conner, yeah, yeah, you definitely talk about the Mastoid Odyssey he had that, and really by the time he started playing, he's probably almost deaf. And one thing I meant to kind of ask this at the Slugger Museum when you were here, but I think we kind of ran out of time there. But you know, there was a few other players at the time, at the turn of the century, that were deaf. Of course, they're all nicknamed Dummy,
Yeah.
Dummy Hoy, Dummy Taylor. Anybody who had hearing problems is named Dummy. But a lot of them seem to, did try to hide. Now, in fact, they tried to. I think the teams would make accommodations for them to help with men. Pete Browning, you almost kind of get the sense that he didn't want people to know about his hearing problems, and just some of the things he did on the field almost like were ways to kind of cover up his issues. Is that
Yeah,
what you
I
think?
think I think one of the things about Pete is he has this kind of big brand personality, but I think he was actually a fairly shy, not very confident individual, and a lot of it has to do with his hearing, right? I mean, I think when you lack some of those kind of social skills of hearing and interactions and stuff like that, it tends to give you some of those things. And his way of kind of dealing with it, I think, is he overcompensated. He spoke very loudly, which obviously would make sense because he can't hear. But he was known for talking about himself, and he would say things about himself, and I think that was also a bit of a defense mechanism. If he can't hear what somebody else is talking about, the safest thing to do is turn the conversation to the one thing you're most intimately familiar with, which is yourself. I also think that he still was a very kind of cocky person on some level. So I think instead of admitting that he had a problem and dealing with it, he would come up with these statements, like, look, I can move and go and try and run down that fly ball, but anybody can shag a fly ball, but nobody can hit like old Pete can. So if I waste my legs doing that, what good am I going to be to you at the plate? So he would kind of cover up by saying things like that. And I think he didn't want to admit necessarily that maybe he had a problem. I think maybe I can't speak to this if he viewed that it would have been some weakness there, but I think he definitely didn't want to admit out loud. It's not something that there ever seems to be a whole lot about that he says publicly about it. It wasn't a well-known, it doesn't even seem to be something that everybody was very much kind of aware of and dealt with and kind of hit. I mean, people knew he had hearing problems and was deaf, and they would make comments about that, but it doesn't seem that they accommodated it or he attempted to make any kind of accommodations besides kind of these kind of statements and things that he would say.
Yeah, yeah. It just seems like you hear other deaf players kind of having the signals and stuff made up for him. I think he was kind of want to keep in the background a little bit. But yeah, so Browning went on. He had his hearing issues, but he was probably the about the best hitter in the American Association for a stretch there. I was trying to look it through some stats. It's kind of hard to compare players, but I saw there's a couple maybe Harry Stovey, maybe Bid McPhee were some players that maybe had some better numbers that played primarily in the association. But Browning was probably just about one of the tops. And he did get into the National League when he was 30 in '91, but he kind of by that time I think the Master Eyes kind of it started kind of slowing him down. But he was still decent in '91. But how in his prime years, how do you think his game would have translated over in the National League?
Well, I think in '91 we get an idea. He still finishes third in batting that year. And he was getting hot at the end of the year. And Kid Gleason, he gets hit by a Kid Gleason pitch and breaks his hand kind of towards the end of the season. And in '91, he started off in Pittsburgh. And, Pittsburgh was a horrible team. He went to Cincinnati. He wasn't much better, but he was on a horrible team. And he seemed to be dealing with a lot of health issues at the time. And then he really kind of had a great second half. So I think it kind of shows that it would have translated very well. I think he would have come over and would have absolutely would have been the tops. I think the Players League is another example of that. The year before, many of those players from the National League were in the Players League with him, and who wins the batting title? It's Pete. So I think it's without a question that if he would have moved over to the National League, that he absolutely would have found success, and I think it would have been just as much success. I mean, that's all speculation, but I think what he did in 1890 and '91, he kind of showed that he could still play with those guys and still was doing that. So I don't think that the talent level was that vastly different, and I think what he was doing would have absolutely translated over.
Yeah, I think what I've kind of I know one time there I listened to a discussion about should the American Association be considered a major league? They said maybe the first 2 years weren't that great, maybe the last 2 years weren't that great, but kind of those middle years, they was absolutely probably on par with the National League and such. So I think it's completely fair to say he would have done fine with the National League teams there. Um,
Well, if I could say, I think too, what maybe, and this is kind of what I was trying to think about when I thought about it. We have these perceptions of it now because we know it's going to be the National League, but at the time, I don't think players were necessarily sitting there saying like, well, it's the National League, it's better, it's the American Association. I think they viewed their league that they were in as just as good. I think, it wasn't like they were striving to get to the National League. Pete was very happy to be in Louisville. He had opportunities to go to the National League. He wanted to be at home. So I don't think it was necessarily that players couldn't get into the National League. I think they were playing where they wanted to play in the cities they wanted to be in at times, and I think, it's not fair to say that like, oh, well, the American Station wasn't was they were trying to be the National League because obviously it was the older league, but I don't think that like at the time they were definitely sitting there going like, oh, if I could only play in the National League and prove myself. I think many of them were happy where they're at, and they were in the cities they wanted to play in and playing baseball where and how they wanted.
Yeah, yeah, and especially Browning because he didn't jump around. I think he was seemed to be very comfortable in Louisville. I asked you this at the Slugger one, but when he left Louisville and joined the Players League, I know a lot of the players were going to that league and he probably made more money, but I still have to think that wasn't a really easy decision for him, despite Louisville's terrible year the year before and all the stuff going on with that club.
Well, I think the decision was made a little easier because Al Johnson was involved with the Cleveland team, and that was one of his oldest friends from Louisville. And he at times would say, he's my only friend that in the world that I have, which wasn't true. He seemed to be pretty close to all those guys from that era. So I think that made it much easier that he had somebody who was going to. I think the bigger thing with Pete is, despite this loud, boisterous personality, deep down inside, he was pretty insecure about stuff. He had opportunities, I think, plenty of times where he could have left and gone somewhere if he really wanted to. But I don't think deep down inside he wanted to leave. I mean, you figure kind of lived at home with his mom. I don't think there was a lot of confidence there for other things. So I think he finally felt it had run its course in Louisville, and he had an opportunity to go play with somebody or around somebody who he felt a connection with. Right, there was a little bit of like a familiar face, which I think he always kind of needed. He really, I don't think he ever wanted to leave home. So I don't think it was like he was striving to the National League and didn't have the opportunity. I think he was very content where he was, despite some of the outward things he would say. It seems there was a lot more where he was very happy to be there until finally, after that horrible season, and he felt they owed him money, and there was just all these kind of breaking points that like he was finally happy to leave.
Yeah, talking about all those Louisville connections, like we kind of discussed, a lot of those guys in Louisville all grew up playing together. I knew like him and like Chicken Wolf and John Reese and some of them were friends. Like the one of the points I read in your book that I found very interesting was Zach Phelps, who was also one of their friends growing up, and he was later the president of the Louisville team, and he's president of the American Association for a little bit, and it kind of got I was reading that, I was kind of wondering, you think that maybe kind of helped Browning more, kind of because I think Phelps kind of helped cover some of his trouble, or at least kept him from being in trouble with the club. I don't know if that really helped
100%.
or yeah,
Yeah,
I didn't know if
a
maybe.
hundred percent. I definitely think he had a friend there, and he leaves the season prior to in 1888, right? The season prior. So again, I think he loses this kind of very important figure who kind of looked out for him and made sure that even though he was getting suspended, so I absolutely think that like Phelps leaving was a big thing. Again, Pete, even though he made that statement one time about like Al Johnson being his only friend in the world, I think he was all close with all those guys from who he grew up. I mean, all the pallbearers at his funeral were all kind of those guys that he played with on those
Yeah,
early Eclipse teams or played with. So he seems to have maintained those connections and stayed close with them all throughout his career after he stopped playing. So I think that absolutely, like him leaving, the organization, Phelps leaving the organization, actually absolutely had an impact on, Pete and how he was treated and how he felt he was treated and stuff. I think with Pete, he always had a perception sometimes that he was being treated unfairly or whatever. Just and
yeah,
so if he had somebody there kind of as a buffer, it absolutely helped.
yeah. I kind of picked up on a little bit of that in the book with Brian, where he kind of his ego was a little frail, maybe. So he was a pretty big figure, but um,
It was that overcompensation. I think a lot of it, like I said, he was overcompensating for some of these insecurities and this lack of hearing and lack of education. I mean, I love the fact that, right? I mean, his name's not Pete, right? We sit here and he's Pete, but that's not even his name. I mean, he was calling people Pete because he couldn't hear their name when it was introduced, and they eventually just kind of put the
yeah,
nickname back on him almost as like a joke towards him.
yeah. I think it's what a lot of people forget about Brian. Is his name's not even Pete. Um, Kind of the same way with Chicken Wolf, or I think even his papers was Jimmy, but Jimmy, no telling where that came from. His name was William, I think.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so we talked about Browning kind of. I think a lot of the SABR folks know that Browning's his mastoiditis probably led to some of his issues with the drinking, and either maybe he didn't start that reason, but it probably intensified a little bit. Um, but I don't know if everybody. What I found interesting was a lot of the maybe we don't know is that his situation also affected a lot of how what he did on the field. Some of the stuff. I mean, it's always Browning's always been kind of known as just the oddball. He did crazy things with his eyes or the way he stood out in the field. Or but you kind of explain that how the mastoiditis kind of is probably due for a lot of that too. So and I don't want to give away every single one in the book. But I was going to say maybe you could throw out a couple examples where you came across that.
Well, I think when we were talking about his fielding, right? So towards the end of his career, there's stories in the paper how he takes to stopping balls and grounders with his feet. And in the papers, they're kind of making fun of it, Pete, what he's doing, and he's doing this with his feet. But I think it makes perfect sense when you think about it. He was really in those years suffering from vertigo. And if you have vertigo and you bend over to pick up a ground ball, it's just going to intensify that feeling of dizziness. So I think there's those things like that. I mean, they talked about how when he stood on the field with 1 foot, it was so odd. But again, he's doing because he can't hear somebody approaching and he's worried about getting run into. I think there was a lot of those things like that. He when he was playing in Cleveland, there was a tree that cast a big shadow across the field, and he often commented later in his career how heat really like impacted him and made him kind of feel lightheaded, which would go into with his mastoiditis and the vertigo and all that. So he stood back in kind of the tree in the shade there. And again, it kind of lends itself to like he's lazy in the field, but he felt that if he moved out of that shade, he was going to get lightheaded and pass out. So I think that like with Pete, it's always very interesting and it's always very important to like hear these stories and kind of understand, like hear what they are, because there's truth to them, but then kind of taking a moment to step back and going, but what is the reality of it, or what is the potential reality? I mean, he did all these crazy things to protect his eyes, and he poured buttermilk into him or did that. But again,
Yeah.
if you think about a man with limited education and he has this issue, and medical practices at the time weren't exactly the best, he's trying to kind of find a way to self-medicate. And so, he's pouring buttermilk in his eyes to help soothe them. And it's funny, I talked with an eye doctor, and he was like, it's funny, he would have been better off just drinking it because of the glutens that are in there. He's probably going to get some kind of infection from the buttermilk in his eye. But again, if there's instant relief there, it was for him like, oh, okay, this is good. So I think it was some of those self-medicating things too, which also becomes interesting. But when you kind of think about the root of it, it makes a little more sense. So I think, to kind of go off on topic, that makes Pete this interesting figure. He's got these crazy myths and legends, which he did, but there's a reason why he did them, or a potential reason why he did them. And it lends to a lot of the stories in his life, some of the drinking stories and some of the crazier events in his life. There can be more truth or a harsher truth or a harsher reality into why it is or what happened than just like, oh, he got drunk and this happened. Well, what actually was transpired there?
Yeah, yeah. I thought that was kind of interesting. And some of the reasons, yeah, you saw things ways he accommodated on the field with this issue. But yeah, you're talking about just the medical practices at the time. Yeah, I just reading it. Brown, he had a rough last couple years there. He probably had cancer and stuff. I was just amazed to read some of the surgeries they were able to perform on him, like to try to relieve the ear pressure, and then probably remove some cancer spots here and there. I was kind of
Yeah, I mean,
flabbergasted
he
on
definitely
that.
towards the end of his life, and again, I think when we talk about that, right, he was institutionalized for a while. I
Yeah,
don't think there's any really good evidence that he had any kind of real mental issues. I just think it was a lack of all these other things, and he was probably in a lot of pain and probably very withdrawn and probably very depressed about that time. So again, I think it was more a lack of an understanding about kind of mental health and mental issues, as opposed to really he had some kind of mental breakdown, which is often written about, that he was institutionalized at the end. He must have been so crazy, but again, he was really suffering at the time from pain in his head and all that. And he had multiple surgeries kind of the last couple of months of his life. And they did, like you said, they found, cancerous tumors, and they were trying to relieve the pressure on his head. And I mean, there was a lot there. And he obviously had drank a lot too. So there's, potentially some cirrhosis and alcohol related type issues as well. So yeah, he was not very healthy towards the end.
yeah, and well, especially towards the end of his career, it's kind of reading like you said, he when he went to the National League in '91, he still had a pretty decent year, but then from then on, and it kind of sounds like his drinking hadn't stopped, but he had curbed it some. He was doing better. He was still seemed to be in the mastoiditis was starting to take effect, but he was still in decent shape. But it just he wasn't getting really a job anywhere. He wasn't really getting a try, and I think that was kind of hard to figure
Yeah.
out.
Yeah, it seems he stopped drinking in 18 in the eight for the 1890 season. he seems to be relatively sober throughout the rest of his life. Though there are stories of him drinking, but it doesn't seem to be quite to the like extent that it was before. He makes a lot of comments, especially in the 1890 season, 1891 season, about it's been so long since I've blown one off or I've had a drink. So at least at that time he seemed to be fairly sober. But then there's some stories a little later on about some drinking kind of again. 1891, he has a good year. Like I said, he finishes third. 1892, he still finishes in the top 10 in the National League. So it's not like he completely falls off a cliff. I do think that his health issues really start kind of coming in. 1893, it's a shortened season. He's not very good. In 1894, he just basically makes a couple of appearances at home when other teams kind of get him to play a couple of games with him. I think he still wanted to play, and he played in some of those other leagues, some of those different, the Southern League, he played a little bit, and he had a little bit of success there. He played and did fairly well. I think that at the end of the day, though, he didn't want to be that far away from home. He was in Columbus and Allentown and some places, and I don't think he really wanted to be too far away. So I think at the end of the day, he kind of came back for that. He still kind of tried to get some jobs. He actually cast it around, and I forget the exact term he used. He wanted to basically be a substitute hitter, basically what was like a designated hitter, and I forget the exact term he used, but he wrote to a couple of teams that, hey, I just want to be on your team, so if you need somebody to hit, I can just kind of do that. But nobody took him up on that. He was actually also very interested in being an umpire. And interestingly enough, with his persona and personality, he was always regarded as being very honest on the field. But I think because of that persona, he was just never going to get that opportunity to do that. I think it was hard to get past who Pete was and then, picture him as kind of this authority figure on the field there. So yeah, he gets out of baseball in 1894, kind of kicks around in some of those other leagues for a little bit, and then just seems to kind of hang around Louisville and talk to the players there and talk about the glory days and talk about what he did and what old Pete used to do.
Yeah, and so I guess I'm surprised that you think Louisville could draw him as just nothing else but if nothing else, maybe an attraction. But like you said, I think it's kind of the rest of the league saw, well, if his own hometown team can't use him, then he's probably not going to do us much good. So that may have hurt him as well.
I think that was
Yeah,
definitely it. And he did seem to be an attraction because he plays a couple of games for St. Louis and Louisville, and they kind of talk about how the stands were packed and people were there to see Pete and see
yeah.
see the old Gladiator again and see old Pete and see the War Horse again. So there was some excitement for that, but it does seem that if your hometown team doesn't deem you worthy of a spot, why are we going to waste our time with it?
And and just you called him the Gladiator. That was one of the things I had on my list because I try to remember. I know there's a couple different stories out there of how he got that nickname. So in your research, what was the background again for Gladiator?
So it's interesting. The name starts popping up in 1887. There was no and this is what we're going to call him. They kind of start mentioning the Gladiator and with it, and it seems to be because he battled sports writers, battled the bottle, battled the ball and field, battled everything. But it just kind of casually pops up in an article, and there doesn't seem to be any lead up to it, and then it sort of sticks. He had a lot of nicknames he just called. I mean, more often than not, he just seems to be old Pete. Early on, he was the War Horse. He also had some of those names like Brown Jug Browning and stuff like that. But for whatever reason, the Gladiator kind of sticks and is the one that, kind of becomes the one that everybody recognizes. But that didn't really come in towards the end of his career. Like 1887, we sort of start seeing it happen, and then it really starts sticking a little bit after that. So it wasn't like that was applied to him early on. But yeah, it's odd. There never doesn't seem to be like this moment where they go, and now he's the Gladiator kind of thing. It just sports writer wrote it and somebody else picked it up, and it just sort of seemed to go from there. And the idea was that he kind of was battling, everything out there, sports writers, the bottle, the ball, anything you could think of.
And bless him, if he'd heard that, he may have gone to his grave thinking that was just a great compliment
Yeah.
of his battling. So there's no telling.
Well,
Um,
and if you don't mind, I think that's what's interesting about Pete, right? And there's this perception of him again of being kind of this illiterate guy, which he
yeah,
mostly seems to be, but sometimes it seems that there's this perception that he would say these things and do these things with no understanding of the bigger picture. But there actually is a lot of stories about that he was very aware of what he was saying, but was happy to play up into that image. And I think that gives a different perception of Pete, right? It kind of sometimes comes across that he's like just the big, like, I'm going to say this silly thing, and look, I have no idea about anything. I'm going to talk about the USS Brooklyn. Somebody's going to say it got hit 27 times, and I'm going to think they're talking about baseball. But really, he may have known what they were talking about and was happy to say those things because it was funny. And then people would just say to him, like, oh, did you hear what old Pete said again? So how kind of unaware he was of what the actual true nature of it was, I think he was a little more aware. There's also stories that like he collected all the articles about him and would
Hmm.
keep them, which would then imply on some level he can read better than he's given credit for. And on the census, he was always written as being able to read and write. Now, it doesn't say to what level, but the story is he's completely illiterate. But there's a lot of kind of stories and things out there that he seems to have been able to read better than people want to lead on. So he was probably more aware of some of those stories and why they're doing it. But I think he was kind of the mindset that, like, people are talking about me. It's never bad regardless. And he was happy to live up to that image because if they're talking about Pete, it's good for me, kind of.
Yeah, half the time if he was reading up on something, somebody may have tried to check with him. He probably couldn't hear what they were saying anyways. They probably took it as he doesn't know he's reading. So, yeah. One thing, yeah, I don't know if everybody also is where among Browning, a lot of Browning's first, but he was also involved in pretty much the first players' strike, and I guess would be Major League history. Then that was look, and I'm trying to remember that was actually took place in Baltimore, didn't it?
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's the 1889 season, which is just the horrendous season. And finally, a number of players just said that, like, we are not going to play. And they kind of signed a protests against Mordecai Davidson, saying they weren't going to play anymore. When it came down to it, six players decided they weren't going to play, and they brought some local guys in from Baltimore to play. But yeah, it was the first kind of player strike, and they said we aren't going to play. Interestingly enough, because I mean, part of that season is Davidson was literally just finding the players to then be able to turn around and play them. He was finding them for anything he could get. You Mr. Ground Ball, I'm going to find you. You did this, I'm going to find you, because he had no money, so he was trying to basically keep the team rolling that way. But eventually, when he was forced to give up the team, a lot of those fines were returned to the players. He took a long time to give those back. Pete ends up still kind of having fines that stayed because it was for things like coming in drunk and
Yeah.
things like that. And interestingly enough, the only fines that Pete ever really argued is in protest, he threw some of his bats into the river at one point, and Davidson fined him for that. He's like, "How are you finding me for
Yeah.
that? Like, they're my bats. I can do what I want with them." But those fines, some of those still stuck, which always kind of like stuck with Pete. And again, is one of the things that I think helps lead him to the path of the Players League towards the end of that season.
Yeah, and I was deep down at one point there. I was surprised to read the part about Browning tossing a bat in the river because that he was one person that he cherished his bats. Uh, yeah, he I guess he just had hordes of them in his basement.
He did. And
Uh,
what's interesting though is he cherished his bats, but he wasn't above lending bats to players and letting players borrow bats and giving bats to players. Now, I do believe he had some that he had maybe a little more personal connection to, but he wasn't above, like, when he got a new order of bats, like, he would give them out to people and let people try them and stuff like that. And he would often kind of joke, as his bats were so big that it doesn't matter if I let you borrow it anyway. You're probably not going to be able to swing it anyway because you're not going to be big enough or strong enough to swing it. So it is interesting that, like, he would throw a bat in the water as much as he cared about them, because I think when he gave them away, he felt he was, on some level doing something special or giving something special away or helping this player.
you so and they named them all. He had a name for all of them too. I don't know how he had that many names. You think he would start running out of names
Yeah,
after a while, but he named them after Bible characters. So
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
I
no,
mean, I think what's interesting too. Another thing about Pete is how he maybe justifies when he is struggling, right? Because he has this belief that all bats have a predetermined number of hits, and when he's not getting a hit, it's because the bat ran out of hits. It's not because of anything he's doing, right? It's an easy way to kind of like take the pressure off yourself. Like, I'm not hitting, but it's not because of anything I'm doing. It's because my bat round hits. So let me get another one and get a new one. And now I can start fresh again because this has new hits in it. So I think it was an interesting way for him to kind of, justify what he was doing and maybe take the pressure off of himself a little bit. I'm not doing anything wrong. It's the bat.
yeah, that bat is out of hits. Time to go to
Yeah.
another one. So um, yeah, it's funny because I know the owner, the Mordecai Davidson, was the owner at the time. He's the one I think he imposed all the fines, trying to make money back. But he's also in Cave Hill Cemetery somewhere. I would love to say that they're pretty close together, but I don't think that's the case. But it's kind of funny.
I,
But
I
there's
wish
some
I would have known when I was out in Louisville. I actually stopped at Pete's grave on that day. I kind of felt like it'd be appropriate to go by and see him. So I wish I would have known that Davidson's grave was nearby. I would have stopped by there as well. So
yeah, and a lot of them, the whole Reese's family is there somewhere, and
yeah.
Chicken Wolf and a bunch of them. So yeah, it's a neat. We actually helped set up. There was a sports tour they have now, includes a lot of them, but also like Muhammad Ali and New
Mm-hmm.
Rockney, not New Rockney, and Paul Hornig. But yeah, so yeah, it's pretty neat. But I would kind of open it up. See if anybody maybe y'all had any There's only a few of us, but see if any of y'all had any questions.
Did he have any kind of career after baseball? Like, did he have
Um,
a profession or job?
he bounced around a lot, and so interestingly enough, money doesn't ever seem to be a problem for him. His family was fairly wealthy. He actually seems to have been pretty good with his money, despite the number of complaints that he had about not getting paid and being owed money. He seems to have done pretty well of holding on to his money. He tries a number of professions. He opens up some saloons. He was a cigar salesman. There's even a story that he was a riverboat, worked on a riverboat for a while. He ran for political office, but none of it really ever stuck. I think he really identified with baseball. And when he didn't have baseball anymore, I think he just really floundered. But I think he could flounder. And again, it wasn't like because he was like this over the top wealthy individual, but I think he always was fairly well with his money. So I think that like he could try these things and open up stuff. And if it didn't work, he kind of move on to the next thing. You know, he owned a little store for a while and stuff like that. So there was nothing again that really ever stuck. He tried to be an umpire, you know, but besides a few times in Louisville and in some games there, he never really got an opportunity with that. So he never had kind of a regular profession after baseball.
And you said he came not maybe not really rich, but I think his dad did fairly well, and he probably came from a little bit of money, so he probably wasn't necessarily forced to do odd jobs and stuff. I think he's probably okay just kind of doing what he wanted to try, but none of it worked, unfortunately.
Yeah, it seems that his family like had maintained some of that wealth. And again, I wouldn't say they were exorbitantly wealthy, but it
Yeah,
seemed they kept that wealth and they did well. And you know, again, he lived at home and literally lived at home, not just Louisville, but he lived at home with his mom his entire life. So on some level, you know, there's probably less, you know, he has to spend there. And so it doesn't seem that he really lived, you know, he did like to dress really fancy. So I think maybe that was where he would spend his money, as he was known for his how well he dressed and you know how good he looked at times. So I think that might have been kind of his you know where he spent his money.
yeah, he was kind of a pretty snappy dresser, it sounded like.
Yeah.
Um, um,
So, Tim, a quick question.
Sure.
As we turn the century into the 19th century, and I saw he died in '05,
Mhm.
but were the modern players of that time, the Honus Wagners, the Ty Cobbs, did they give any kind of thought to Pete Browning? What was his standing in baseball as we moved into, you know, '05, '06, '07, and World Series started coming around? Just was there any thought to his legacy at all?
Yeah, I think so. Honus Wagner is an interesting person because Pete knew Honus from Louisville, and he actually gave him one of his old bats. Honus had come over to visit him, and it's not kind of hard to believe that Honus comes to understand the power of you know the Hiller Company and what would be Louisville Sluggers from getting that bat from Pete, and then you know Honus goes on to get his name on the bat as kind of the first person there. Um, in the early kind of 20th century, Pete, when you read stuff, is still kind of talked about as like one of the great hitters, and they kind of refer to him that. But I think, as always happens, right, we only have a memory for like one generation back, and so as you start moving into you know the teens and the 20s, anybody who maybe would have had a direct connection with him, he's kind of starting to be forgotten a little bit, as probably many of those players were. And they're looking at those other players now, Honus Wagner and Ty Cobb and those players there. And I think because we only really have a memory for kind of one generation back, and those sports writers would have been gone and leaving. So early on, yes, he was still talked about kind of like as one of those great players, which I think becomes part of an interesting conversation when you talk about him. You know, why isn't he in the Hall of Fame? Well, he was looked at as one of those great hitters, and people did refer to him that way, and they talked about him in those glowing terms. But then it kind of becomes forgotten. In 19th century baseball, right, we all know it's hard to understand because we can't pull up YouTube and we can't look at it. And it's a different thing. But he was absolutely kind of remembered in that fashion. And there's even some articles, you know, and some stuff I would say through the teens and 20s that still refers to him back as such. But eventually, you know, as anything, he kind of fades away, and you know, because there's not anything to look at. So for a while, he definitely was still talked about as kind of one of those great players at that time.
no, and I think one of the, like, we talk, sometimes we think stats are a little bit overdone. Maybe we're not so excited about reading, but I think one of the good things we started seeing in recent years is all development of new stats to compare players of old days that, take a new light on some of them. And I guess there's the hope that maybe someday that'll apply to Pete Browning, that some of these, new generations will look and say, gosh, this guy's numbers are really impressive. It wasn't a long lasting career, but it was, wow, he really, he really had some good numbers. Why is he not in the Hall of Fame yet?
And I think along with that, one of the things that I kind of heard a couple times as I was talking with people throughout like my research was, we look at it through our lens, right? Like how we view 19th century baseball or how we view those stats, right? And we've valued and devalued certain stats. But if at the time, the people who saw him play, the writers and the players, if they talked about him as one of the greatest players, who are we to disagree with what they saw with their own eyes, right? We're trying to judge him through our 21st century lens, and that's not always fair, and that's not fair for any generation, right? I mean, we have the ability now at some level because we can go put stuff on YouTube and pull up games, but that can help us understand that. But for Pete, like at the time, people were talking about him as one of those great players, so I don't think it's fair for us to discount how he was viewed at that time, regardless of how we view stats now, right? If at the time they talked about him as one of the greatest players and the legendary slugger, why are we going to doubt those who saw him play when none of us here did,
Yeah. And you look at, you find old articles from the turn of the century, like I think Kelly was asking about, or the 1910s, where they talk about how, talk about the old players of old, like Browning and Tip O'Neill and some of them. So, Tim, how long did you spend researching on this book?
I would say it was probably, so I first probably put pen to paper in 2019. The book came out in September. So it was a 5-year process. I would say, I probably started writing a couple months after researching, but it was a continuous, obviously, like research probably. So I'd probably say it was a good 3 years of just research. And then once kind of the manuscript was done and it was with the publisher, then it was editing. And even through there was still always finding something new out and coming across something else. But I would say it was a good 3 years of research for that. And then, those other 2 years when we were kind of just dealing with almost the actual whole manuscript, there was still a level of like finding new stuff out. And there's always something there to find and a new fact or a new nugget to kind of dig into.
Yeah. Well, I'll say, I certainly appreciate the work you put into it in the book because, I think I'm like a lot of people where I always grew up thinking baseball started in 1900. Anything before that was dark ages and guys with sticks and whatever they could find. But baseball is really fascinating before that, so it's always kind of neat to see an effort around preserving some of that, and especially for us in Louisville. Just how many people remember that Louisville was a Major League Baseball city for many years. So,
Well, that
really
that was a lot of fun. I do think it's fun to go back and look at 19th century baseball because it's when baseball's learning how to be baseball or figuring out how to be baseball. Because there's things we take for granted that if you watch a game in 1903 or 1933 or 43 or 53, they pretty much look the same. But it wasn't that way in 1893 and 1883. Like they looked different. I think it was interesting because baseball was figuring out who it was going to be and what it was going to become. And so it's interesting to see how players were responding to that and things that they did. And so I find that very interesting with 19th century baseball. I mean, it's a shame that we don't have any video of it that we can turn around and watch and see what it looked like. I mean, we can imagine it and we can see people recreate it, but we'll never really see what it would have been like at that time. And that to me is always what I love to kind of picture and imagine is what it would have been like with this crowd and, a crowd of people watching a game, not on their phones doing anything, like intently watching. This is their one event that they're going to see for that week, So I think that would have been an amazing experience to be able to see what it looked like with that.
Do you think that the success of the Louisville Eclipse had a bearing on Louisville Grays the 1870s?
I do because if the Grays had stuck around, the Eclipse wouldn't maybe taken that prominence they had. I mean, the other argument with that, or not argument, but if the Grays were there, right, Pete more than likely joins them at some point, right? If they're still around, 78, 79, 80, when he's probably getting ready to play Major League Baseball, he probably plays with the Grays. So then all of a sudden he's in the National League and he joins a little earlier, right? He only joins, Major League Baseball and the American Association in 1882 because that's when the Eclipse starts. But if you got the Grays in there in 1880, is he not playing as a 17 or 18-year-old? I don't think that's out of the question.
I think he does.
I 100%. I mean, because there's the game when he struck out the side to end the game and shut them out when he was pitching when he was 16 years old. So I think he absolutely proved he could play with them, So yeah, if the Grays are there, that changes things, But I think them not being there allows the Eclipse to evolve and become this special thing that wasn't necessarily a major league team, but they're this semi-pro team, but that competed with these major league teams. And then, they just basically took that team with the addition of a few players and were able to make them a major league team. So I think that's an amazing kind of step that not all those other teams were able to take.
Yeah. You know, last question. I forgot. Gary had to drop off. I forgot. Did you ever? Because he lived in Baltimore for a while. You only ever cross paths up there, did you?
I did not know.
He was up there, I think, a long time ago. So I know. But okay. Well, the guys, got any more questions?
I just want to say thanks for writing the book on Pete.
Yeah.
I learned of Pete, you know, you mentioned maybe, you know, you're a Cardinals fan from the 70s and Reds fan from the 80s, whatever. I go back to the 60s. And I had an old statistic book, sporting news statistics book, and all the 400 hitters. And Pete Browning was on there, and I saw that he was from Louisville. You know, being a Kentucky kid, I was like, oh man, who? So, you know, I started studying what I could, you know, at that point in time. But he is an interesting
What was
figure.
baseball like the 1860s?
The 1860s? Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Yeah. No, I'm not that old. I'm not that old, Ryan. Give me a break, buddy.
Oh yeah. Thanks for specifying that.
But so yeah, I mean, I don't understand why he was never really considered for the Hall. But I do appreciate you writing the book.
I mean, I think as far as the Hall goes, I mean, I think part of it is like I was mentioning before, when the Hall starts coming around, the American Association on one level had been kind of forgotten about, and those stats had been kind of pushed aside. So some of those players from that era in the American Association had kind of been forgotten about. And the focus was solely on the National League. And then you figure baseball scholarship in the the 30s and 40s and 50s isn't what it is now, where we can look at and have a better understanding of that. So I think that impacted that as well. And then I think it took a long time to kind of come around to the American Association and have an understanding of that. And I think the problem now is we have such a backlog of players that we're trying to figure out how to handle getting them in, that like, what do we do with these 19th century guys? And I think Pete's not the only 19th century guy that at least deserves a look. There's plenty of those guys and plenty of those American Association guys. But I think, some people I talk to, like, well, what are we going to do? Do we have time for that? How are we going to handle that? I mean, I think they could take one last stab and say, let's just look at the 19th century and get 10 or 12, whatever it takes, guys, and just be done with it. We can close the books on the 19th century, right? We have enough research and scholarship out there now that we know. But at the time, like, I think Pete was a pretty forgotten figure by that point because of his American Association, most of it. Those sports writers who would have been directly connected with him had probably passed on. So there was nobody who had seen him play necessarily who was saying, yeah, but don't forget about old Pete, how good he was. So I think it's taken us a long time to kind of come back around and recognize what he may have done and how good he was at that time.
At least we always have the SABR Overlooked Legend Committee, I guess. So,
and he was the first, right? He was the first one to get it. So clearly
he was the first one. Yep.
Yeah, that's there's clearly was recognition on some level that maybe we missed this guy.
Yeah. All right. Well, Tim, I certainly appreciate it. I'll let y'all go, but I thanks for joining us for a while. And the book great. It was interesting material, and it flows well too. It was an easy read, so very informative. So that's kind of like so.
Thank you. Thank you guys for having me. It was fun to come talk to you guys. If you guys ever have any questions about anything you think about afterwards, you can get me on any kind of social medias or whatever. Please shoot me a message. I love to connect on there. You can always reach out. I get back pretty quickly. So if you ever have any questions, please feel free. But thanks for your support. If you got the book, or if you're thinking of getting the book, like, I really appreciate it. It's great to come and talk baseball and talk Pete.
If you find yourself down our way again, please let us know so we can stop. We can say hey.
Well, I will be in Lexington at the Kentucky Book Festival November 2nd. So if anybody's in Lexington and wants to come see me and Al Roker at the book festival, come stop by. So Al's table is probably gonna be bigger than mine, I think, but it's fine.
That's all right. You can absorb some of that.
Yeah.
All right. Y'all take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.